Hello, my friends. Thanks for joining me. Today, I am going to teach you just the very basics about your transverse abdominals. Now, if you've never heard this term before, just know that you're not alone. Many people don't know about the transverse. It's your deepest abdominal layer, which means it's closest to the spine, closest to the pelvis. And we have 4 abdominal layers. First is the transverse, then it's your internal obliques, then your external obliques, then your rectus abdominals. The rectus abdominals is the muscle that gives you that six-pack, if that's what you're going for. But your transverse abdominals is actually your deepest layer of abdominal stabilizing, not just for your stomach and the front of your spine, but also for your lower back. So the transverse abs, along with your other abdominal layers, originates on the front of your pelvis, on your pubic bone and your hip bones, and then has fibers that run all the way up to your low ribs and the tip of your sternum here. So the transverse abs are not just the lower belly, as some people say, but actually it has fibers that run all the way up to the tip of your sternum. And the transverse abdominal muscle works when the pelvis is neutral. Now, that's a really important piece of this puzzle, because if you, let's say, come onto your back and you do abdominal work where you spread your lower back into the mat and do whatever you're doing with your head or your legs, if your pelvis is not in neutral and your lower back is pressed down into the mat, your other 3 layers of abdominal muscles are working, but your transverse abs are no longer working. Your transverse abs work most efficiently when your pelvis is in neutral. And neutral means that you have that little natural lumbar curve in your lower back. So from the side, just to revisit what neutral is, from the side, roughly, depending on the shape of your bones, the pubic bone and the hip bones would be flush. Take out any flesh or abdominal layer here. The pubic bone and the hip bones would be flush. So if my hip bones tip forward of my pubic bone, I am no longer in neutral. And if my pubic bone tips forward of my hip bones, I am no longer in neutral. So neutral is when your pelvis, if you think of it like an upright bowl, is upright. So you're not spilling it forward and you're not spilling it backward. And it's in neutral that your transverse abs will work most efficiently. You'll strengthen your lower belly and strengthen your lower back. So my background is in classical ballet, modern dance. I first started teaching Pilates before teaching yoga. My personal opinion is that the yoga world needs a little bit more of that Pilates influence about what transverse abs is and what the transverse does and how that translates into our yoga postures. So for those of you that are yoga practitioners out there, I just want you to keep this in mind, that anytime you are doing abdominal work on your back with your lower back pressed into the mat, you're working other abdominal muscles, which is good, but you're not actually stabilizing or working your transverse unless you're in neutral pelvis. And that's just what I find most commonly in the yoga world, is that abdominal work is being taught with the pelvis tipped back into a posterior cat tilt. And when we're doing abdominal work on our back, the lower back is spread into the mat, tipping the pelvis into that posterior tilt, which again strengthens other abs, but not targeting transverse. That is more of what the yoga world needs, is neutral pelvis with transverse engaged. So today I will teach you just a couple of really simple exercises you can do at home to strengthen your transverse. And one of the specialties that I have is working with injuries and especially lower back conditions. So many people with disc issues and sciatica type pain have a weak transverse and an overstretched lumbar spine, because most abdominal work that people practice is not in neutral pelvis, but instead with that lower back pressed into the mat. So again, if you have lower back disc issues, or if you have sciatica, this may be very helpful for you to access your transverse abs to not just strengthen your stomach, but strengthen your lower back. And that's what most of us need. Okay, so come onto your back. And you may just want to watch this once or follow along with me. Generally, when we bend our knees and place our feet flat, when we bend our knees, most people automatically press their lower back into the mat. Now, when you press your lower back into the mat, or I prefer to say spread your lower back into the mat so that there's not clenching involved, when you spread your lower back into the mat, your pubic bone comes higher than your hip bones. That's not bad. It's good for certain work. It means that your obliques, your internal, your external obliques, and your rectus abdominals are working a little bit in order to make that posterior or cat tilt happen in your back. Now, when you do that, it gently stretches your lower back, perhaps. It works those 3 abdominal muscles, but it doesn't target or work your transverse. So first, as you come onto your back here and bend your knees, just simply notice if your first instinct is to spread your lower back into the floor. If it is, that's fine. Just simply notice it. But know that when you spread your lower back into the floor and your pubic bone then is higher than your hip bones, you are not in neutral pelvis, and therefore your transverse abs won't turn on or strengthen. So we'll start just with a few pelvic tilts so that you can get a sense of even where your pelvis is in space. So first, do spread your lower back into the mat. Think of hollowing your stomach. That means your navel drops down towards your spine. Try not to clench your glutes as you do this. And hollow your stomach, tilt your lower back into the mat so that your pubic bone is higher than your hip bones. And this again is called technically a posterior tilt. So just notice how that feels. This is probably how you do most of your ab work on your back, if you do ab work on your back. Now on an inhale, release that little tilt just so that your lower back lifts up away from the mat a little bit. And I would describe it as having a little breath of air between your lower back and your back waistband and the mat. And then as you exhale, navel to your spine, try not to clench your glutes, and just tilt so that your lower back is in contact with the mat again. That's your posterior tilt. And then inhale, release that. And as you exhale, hollow your stomach, lower back spreads into the mat. Pubic bone is now higher than your hip bones. Your transverse is not working now, but your other abs are. And then inhale, release that. So you have that little breath of air between your back waistband and the mat. And do that 2 more times. Exhale, navel to your spine. You spread your lower back into the mat. Pubic bone is higher than your hip bones. And then as you inhale, gently release that. You have a little breath of air, that space between your back waistband and the mat. And last time, exhale as you round. And inhale as you release. Now again, as I showed briefly standing, this will vary, depend on your gender, depending on also just the size of the bones of your pelvis. But generally, we know we're in a neutral pelvis from the side here when the pubic bone and the hip bones are level. So if you could imagine a triangular plate from your pubic bone to your hip bones, you'd want that plate to be flat, right? So that your pubic bone is not higher than your hip bones. But you're in neutral pelvis when your pubic bone and hip bones are level, and you have that little bit of real natural lumbar curve in your lower back. Now, still with your knees bent and your feet flat here, just bring your hands, your fingertips, to just inside your hip bones. So that's a couple inches for most of us out to the side of the navel. Relax your head, relax your arms. Breathe deeply here. And as you exhale, imagine that there is a rubber band spreading wide from hip bone to hip bone, becoming taut across the front of your pelvis. You don't have to move your pelvis in order to feel this. And then take a deep breath in. And again, as you exhale, think of that rubber band spreading taut from hip bone to hip bone. And hopefully you feel under your fingertips that there is a little bit of a contraction just to the outside of your navel, just to the inside of your hip bones, and that little bit of contraction is your transverse abs. Now notice here that I am not spreading my lower back into the mat to make this happen. Pelvis is neutral, hip bones and pubic bone are level. And just under the fingertips, think of that rubber band spreading taut, wide from hip bone to hip bone. And actually that rubber band spreads across the outside of your waist and all the way attaching to the lumbar spine, because that's where the transverse attaches. So as you spread wide across the two front hip bones, you're also working a little bit of that transverse in your lower back to help keep that natural lumbar curve. So your transverse abs are also, could be considered a spinal muscle, as it helps to stabilize the natural curve of your lower back. Take another full inhale here. And especially on the exhale, just think of that little rubber band spreading wide across from hip bone to hip bone. Now this would be considered a preliminary transverse abdominal exercise, just to simply feel that little bit of contraction of the transverse as you exhale across the front of the pelvis. Now, one other way to feel it pretty well is to straighten your legs, because when we have our legs straight, we're less tempted to press the lower back into the mat, and it's less natural to do so. Have your legs straight, bring your feet and your legs as close together as possible, and just keep your hands on your hip bones and the fingers just to the outside of your navel again. Notice here that naturally you have that little bit of curve in your lower back. Now flex your ankles so your toes pull back towards your shins, press your heels down. Take an inhale. And as you exhale, press one heel down and float the other leg up just 2 or 3 inches, just barely off the mat. And as you inhale, place that leg down. And as you exhale, float the other leg up and press that stabilizing heel, that heel that's on the mat, press it down as the other leg rises. And then inhale, both legs down, press the heels. Wait for your exhale and float the other leg up. Now we're keeping the movement small so we can just focus on that rubber band across the front of the pelvis. And with your hands, really try to sense here any movement going on in your pelvis. Float the leg up as you exhale. And inhale it down. And then using your transverse abs, try to keep your pelvis completely still. So the transverse abdominals, that muscle, that deepest abdominal muscle, helps to stabilize the pelvis when it's in neutral, and it helps to stabilize the pelvis so that we can move the thighs and the legs independently of the pelvis. So if I were to lift one leg up and let my pelvis tip and press my lower back into the mat, the transverse turns off. Hip flexors working, lower back gets overstretched, other abdominal muscles take over. If you keep your pelvis in neutral and completely still as you float one leg up, your transverse abs have to work in order to stabilize. So just continue with this from side to side a few more times, and you'll probably notice here that one side, when you lift that leg, the pelvis wants to move a little bit more. And we all have one side that is just stronger than the other, and that's completely natural and normal. Exhale as you bring the leg up, keeping the pelvis still, inhaling it down, and exhaling the other leg up. And just do this 2 more times from each side. Think of that rubber band spreading taut. Try to keep your pelvis completely still so the thighs are moving separate of the pelvis. You've got your natural lower back curve, which we want for the health of our spine. We don't want to press that lumbar curve out of our spine. It's there for a reason. It's designed for a reason. And one more time on each side. Now bend one knee, then the other knee, and hug your knees up towards your shoulders or in towards your chest. Rock a little bit from side to side. And we'll take one more exercise, but before we do, just to reiterate here, the transverse abdominals is the deepest abdominal layer that helps us stabilize the pelvis when we can then move our legs independently. And it's not to say that our lower back should not stretch to some degree, but most people, I think it's safe to say, most people's lower back issues come from their lumbar spine, the lower back, getting overstretched, like when you reach for something and you sprain or overstretch a muscle in your lower back. And those issues also come from the lumbar spine being weak. So your transverse abdominals, we call it an abdominal muscle, but it wraps around to the lower back. So when the transverse abs contract, it doesn't just contract across the front of the pelvis, but the side waist, and also helps to support and contract to enable us to have a lumbar curve. So most people that I work with, and myself included, need more transverse work. And most people that I work with who have had any lumbar spine, lower back issues need more transverse work. And that's really hard to find when we're doing really fancy abdominal exercises. It's these really subtle, small, slow movements that kick on and strengthen the transverse. So I'm going to reiterate, and we'll do one more time. Just the pelvic tilts, then the single leg lifts, and then we'll add on just one more exercise for the transverse. So again, if you're new to feeling where your pelvis is and how it moves, just come onto your back. This is a good one to start with. Your knees will be bent, feet flat. And first, feel with your hands, your pubic bone, your hip bones, and just try to find where they are roughly level, that triangular plate. That will be roughly your neutral pelvis. Your transverse is already having to work there. Take a deep breath in. And as you exhale, navel to your spine, think of spreading your lower back into the mat. Hollow your stomach so your pubic bone is higher than your hip bones. So now you're gently stretching your lower back. You're using other abdominals, not your transverse. And now as you inhale, release that tilt. Find that little natural curve in your lumbar spine. Your transverse will have to kick on. And as you exhale again, gently spread your lower back, finding that little tilt. Do that one more time. Inhale. The rubber band spreads wide from hip bone to hip bone, and then exhale, spread the lower back into the mat. Release that and come back to neutral. Straighten one leg down, then the other. Bring your feet as close together as you can. Pull your toes back towards your shins. Use your hands on the front of your hips, your fingers just to the outside of your navel. And on an exhale, float one leg up, press the opposite heel down, and try to keep your pelvis still. As you inhale, bring that foot down. And as you exhale, float the other leg up. And you can feel under your hands that your pelvis will probably want to tilt a little bit. And that, again, is completely natural. Think of that rubber band spreading wide from hip bone to hip bone in order to keep your pelvis still and move your thighs independently of your pelvis. And just do this one more time from side to side. Exhale as you float the leg up. Inhale it down. Continue to flex your ankles. And exhale, float the leg up. Now both heels down, bend one knee, then the other. And we'll take one more transverse abdominal exercise here. So again, find your neutral. So your lower back is not pressed down into the mat, knees are bent. If it's helpful for you, just keep your hands on the front of your pelvis. And now on an exhale, think of relaxing your leg and just float one knee so it's hovering above your hip without moving your pelvis. And then inhale the leg down. Wait for your exhale. Keep the pelvis still and float the other knee up into what's called tabletop. So the knee is just hovering directly above that hip. And then inhale it down. Wait for the exhale and float the other leg up. Now I know this seems really simple and really subtle. It's not going to feel like any deep belly burn or like, wow, I really worked my abs. But know that this deep core work is going to be subtle and actually more stabilizing than most of the exercises that some people do to get the six-pack abs. I know that sounds extreme, but it's true. So floating the leg up on the exhale, think of exhale effort. And exhale, float one leg into tabletop. Just think of that leg being hollow, relaxed. Think of floating the leg up because your abs are working. You have that little space in your lower back. Do one more from side to side. And it's really about differentiating the movement of the pelvis from the legs. So the legs can move independently of the pelvis. When the pelvis has to stabilize, the transverse kicks in. And then bring your knees up towards your shoulders or in towards your chest. Float your forehead up towards your knees. Rock a little from side to side. Now, I'm not in any way saying that doing abdominal work on your back with your lower back spread into the mat is bad. It's not bad, but you're not working your transverse abs when you do abdominal work in that way. So your transverse abs, again, they work in neutral. If you were standing, your pelvis is upright, or when you're on your back, when you have that just that little breath of air, that natural lumbar curve in your spine, then your transverse abs are working. If you're spreading your lower back into the mat and doing abdominal work on your back that way, you're working your internal obliques, your external obliques, and your rectus abdominals, which are also good, and they also need to work. Again, those of you with lumbar or lower back disc issues or sciatic issues, I would really encourage you to focus on strengthening your transverse abs and not doing abdominal work with your lower back pressed into the mat as often. Okay, so we need the gamut. We need to strengthen all of our abdominals. We need to strengthen all of our muscles in different ways. Personally, I believe that there's a misunderstanding or just a non-understanding of really what the transverse abs are and where they are. So when you hear language like lower belly or navel to spine, your abdominal muscles, all 4 layers, are in the front of your pelvis and are in your lower belly. So we want to be specific about the position of the pelvis to really know what abdominal muscle we're working. Navel to spine, or lifting in the lower belly, or engage your abdominals or engage your core, doesn't necessarily target our transverse. Again, the transverse is usually the muscle that is underused, underutilized, and a little bit harder to find because it's very subtle work. So I encourage you to just do those little pelvic tilts and then have your legs straight. Do one leg at a time, lifting up, keeping your pelvis still, and then doing one leg at a time with the knees bent into tabletop just to start to find the work of the transverse abs. And it's simply about keeping your pelvis still, lifting the leg on the exhale or tilting the pelvis on the exhale. You'll start to feel that movement in your pelvis. You'll start to engage your transverse more and therefore help to strengthen your deepest abdominal muscle along with your lower back. All right. So thanks for joining me for your basic transverse little tutorial here. For more classes of all levels and varying lengths, please visit my website, jamieelmeryoga.com. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the videos that you find helpful, and I will see you again soon. Have a great day.